place you do not know. Lech, on your journey I will bless you, and you shall be.
Welcome to our 57th and last of 2020 episode of Julia's Miracles. We're blessed this evening, this afternoon, our time, his evening, to have a wonderful presentation in front of us on archaeology, a favorite subject of ours over the last couple of months.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Lana, for whatever you did to the website. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this, whatever it is, presentation, which is the last one for this year. The day after tomorrow, we have a day off to celebrate the very fact that we're getting rid of 2020, and then we will welcome 2021. And next week, next year, we will meet as usual. And we decided to start with some really special, interesting, unusual, I believe, topics. So the topic of the next presentation, next Tuesday, will be about women spies, women in the intelligence, women in the secret units. The presentation will be made by a gentleman who is a former Mossad agent himself for about 30 years in a row. And he will be talking about his colleagues who had to combine intelligence and family life and being mother and a Mossad agent in the same time. This is something I cannot even imagine, but he will tell you about it. So you're more than welcome to join us next Tuesday on this specific presentation. And this will be the first one of January, which is a month dedicated to women leaders, women fighters, women which are doing duties which are not traditionally expected from women. So this will be a very much of a feminist oriented month. So details will be told later, but you have much to expect, seriously. Ladies, gentlemen alike. And then first tour of the month will be to Masada. I realize that it's not unusual, but it is wonderful, beautiful, special. And my previous attempt to have a tour of Masada was not the most successful one because it was too hot. And Noam, myself, and the cell phone, we all melted up there. So if you've been on this tour, that was a disaster. So this time it will be pre-recorded. It was nice and cool. And I believe you will enjoy the presentation next Thursday on Masada. So this is the first week, and then we have so much more to offer. And before Professor Maeir will just, go home because we don't let him speak. And I'm very much honored and privileged to introduce Professor Maeir of Bar-Ilan University, the director of the Excavation Archaeological Project of es-Safi, the hometown of Goliath. And every time I think of Professor Maeir, it's like, oh, this is Goliath's dad. So let us all listen to Professor Maeir. And thank you so much for joining us. Professor Maeir, it's yours.
Professor, make sure you unmute.
Unmute. Okay, hear me now? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to give the talk. It's very impressive. There have been so many lectures before me, so I'm glad to finish up the year. Let me introduce myself. My name is Aren Maeir. I'm a professor of archaeology at Bar-Ilan University. As you probably hear, I'm I came from the United States to Israel way back when I was a child, and I lived in Israel since then, studied in Jerusalem, went to the army, and then became an archaeologist, and I've been an archaeologist since the 1980s. And in 1997, or rather 1996, I started the project of excavations at this astounding site called es-Safi. And I'm going to give you a little taste of some of the very nice finds and the special remains that we have from this site over the last 25 years. And I'll be focusing particularly on the remains relating to the Philistines, the well-known enemies of Israel in the biblical period. And of course, the most famous Philistine from the site of Gath is of course, the giant Goliath. So let's start. Yes. So if you look at the map of modern Israel and what we would call the southern coastal plain, that's the area between Tel Aviv and Gaza. This is the area that in the biblical period would be called Philistia. And this is because this is where the Philistines and the Philistine culture was situated. And in this area, there were 5 major cities: Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza along the coast, Ekron and Lachish, and Gath in the interior. Now, we know of these sites very well from the biblical text, and archaeologically, up until recently, we knew about Ashdod and Ashkelon, which were excavated, and also the names of the site were, the ancient names of the site were retained. Ekron was identified with a site called Tel Mukane, and it was then excavated. And then in 1997, after I was just about finishing my doctorate, I was looking for a project to begin. And I decided with a bunch of friends to try to excavate at Tel es-Safi, and many people had suggested that Gath of the Philistines was located at Tel es-Safi, and we decided to give it a try. And when I started the project, I was, if you would have asked me, I would have said, oh yeah, I'll excavate here for a decade. I'll find great finds, and I'll wrap it up and move on to the next site. And now, after close to 25 years, and in fact, this coming summer, it's going to be 25 years since I started the project, I'm still going away. And in fact, I probably will stop the excavation before I have all the answers. And the truth is, if I would work for 100 years, we probably wouldn't have all the answers. And the 5th Philistine city, Gaza, is unfortunately unexcavated, at least archaeologically. They're excavating all kinds of tunnels there nowadays, but that's not archaeology. And hopefully one day we'll be able to get to Gaza and see what remains of the Philistine city can be found. Now, Tel es-Safi, or Gath, is located exactly on the border between 2 very important geographic regions in Israel. On the one hand, you have the coastal plain, or as we said in the biblical period, this would be called Philistia. Then you have the area between the coastal plain and the central hills, which is in Hebrew called the Shfela, or this is what we would call the foothills. And the foothills were the region between where the Philistines sat in the west and the Israelites sat in the east. The Israelites and the Judites were in the central hills, the area that we would call today Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, and the Philistines were on the coast. And the region in between was sort of a border region, a region that when the Philistines were stronger, they pushed eastward. When the Israelites were stronger, they pushed westwards, and back and forth. And for example, stories of the interface between the Philistines and the Israelites, such as the story of David and Goliath or the story of Samson, very often occur in this border region. And Gath is situated just on the border between Philistia and the Shfela. And in fact, if you go to the biblical text and count the amount of times that the city of Gath is mentioned in comparison to the other Philistine cities, it's mentioned more often. And why? Because it's the first place where the Israelites met, where the Judites came when they were going towards Philistia. And that's why it's so important. Now, if you want to see it from a geographic point of view, here, this is a Google Earth satellite view looking from the east above the Judean foothills, the Shfela, looking towards the coast. You can see here Ashkelon and Gaza along the coast. And of course, this is the coast of northern Sinai going towards Egypt. Here you can see the Shfela. And this already is the coastal plain. And this white line you see over here, this is what we call today Route 6, the Trans-Israel Highway. And Tel es-Safi is located just on the border, 1 foot in the 1 foot in the coastal plain, 1 foot in Gaza and in the Shpela. And because of that, it was an important point for interface between the Philistines and the Israelites. And a famous story, biblical story, and we'll get back to this figure soon, the story of David and Goliath, according to the biblical text, occurred in the Elava Valley between Sochol, which is located here, and Sochol, which is located here, and Azekah, which is located here. And this battle occurred somewhere around here. And then when the Philistines were defeated by the Israelites, they ran away in the Elah Valley to Gath over here, and to Ekron, which is slightly to the north. So that gives you the basic geographic setting. Now, Gath itself, Tel es-Safi, is in a very large site, and in fact, it's one of the largest, if not the second or third largest, pre-classical site in Israel. That means before the time of the Romans, and it's a site which is comprised of a large upper tell and a expansive lower tell below it to the north. It reaches a size of about 50 hectares, which again is extraordinary for ancient times. And you can see here from all directions, it's very, very impressive. And one of the important features is the white chalk cliffs that you can see on the northwestern side of the hill. And this is an interesting and very predominant feature, which in fact may have given the site its name in later periods. In earlier periods, it was called Gath. In later periods, we know the Arabic name is Tel es-Safi. Tel es-Safi, es-Safi in Arabic is something like pure, so it's the pure mound because of the white cliffs. And in the Crusader period, in the 12th century CE, there was a fortress on the site which was called Blanche Gard. That means the white fortress, and probably because of these white chalk cliffs. Now, we've been excavating for many, many years, and you can see here the upper city and the lower city, and all these marked off areas with the English letters represent the various excavation areas that we have excavated throughout the city, and I'll talk about some of them. And if you'll notice, on the upper city, we have one excavation area here, and most of them are on the side here. And the reason being is that this part of the tell is more or less completely covered over by the remains of the modern Arab village of Tel es-Safi, which was abandoned during the Israeli War of Independence in 1948. And since I'm interested in early periods, Bronze and Iron Age, this is an area which we haven't excavated extensively. But in the lower city, and we'll talk about this further on, we have quite a few areas of excavation. And one of the reasons why we'll do this, and I'll talk about this later, is because the Iron Age remains are right near surface. And if we move on, why aren't you moving on? Let me see. Okay, we move on. We get to the beginning of our story. Now, we're going to focus here on Gath of the Iron Age. The Iron Age is a period of approximately between 1200 and 586 BCE. That's the time frame. And during this period, we have various peoples and cultures which are probably well known. On the one hand, we have the Sea peoples and the Philistines among them, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But on the other hand, the Iron Age is the time when the Israelites appear in the land. And the Israelites, the first document mentioning the Israelites is just before 1200 BCE. And then the Israelites settle down in the land of Israel. And later on, around 1000 BC, that's the beginning of the Israelite monarchy, the time of David and Solomon, and the two kingdoms, finally to be destroyed in 586 BCE. Now, the Philistines are one of the groups that appear at this time. And let's give a little background. In the period before the Iron Age, the period we call the Late Bronze Age, which is more or less between 1500 and 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean area was an area with kingdoms and empires and trade and diplomatic relations and a very, very clear world order. And we know this both from the archaeological remains and from quite a lot of ancient texts that have been found. And around 1200, a little before, a little after, all this world order starts to come apart. And for various reasons, and it's probably due to a complex set of reasons, but this includes climate change, perhaps earthquakes, perhaps movements of people coming from other parts which push other people, And what eventually happened is the cultures and polities and kingdoms and empires and peoples that lived in the central and eastern Mediterranean went through an enormous change. And for example, in Greece, during the Bronze Age, we had the Mycenaean culture. And the Mycenaean culture was comprised of various cities with palaces, which ruled over as kingdoms throughout the region of Greece. And around 1200, these palace kingdoms started to come apart. And most probably, the famous story of the battle of the Greeks against the Trojans, the Battle of Troy, occurred during this period, sometime around 1200, when things were beginning to come apart. In Turkey, we had the Hittite Empire, and sometime after 1200, the Hittite Empire simply collapses. In Egypt, the Egyptian Empire, which controlled both Egypt and into Israel and even up into central Syria, slowly lost its power and withdrew from the region. In Canaan itself, the area of the land of Israel, there were various city-states, and many of these city-states started to crumble. And at the same time, we see the appearance of all kinds of new groups that we were not in this region beforehand. I mentioned before the Israelites appear at this time, the Arameans appear at this time, the Sea Peoples and the Philistines appear, and there's a whole new change in what's going on, what are the relations, what type of trade is conducted, etc. And at this time, this is where the Philistines appear, and perhaps the earliest and most significant evidence of the appearance of the Philistines and the Sea Peoples comes from these beautiful reliefs which exist in the temple, the mortuary temple of Ramses III in Egypt, in a place called Medinat Habu, where we have, among other things, a depiction of a battle on sea. Here you can see the sea battle, and on land between the Egyptian forces and these Sea Peoples. And among the Sea Peoples, we have a group called the Philistines. And this is our first mention of these people, who then, when we look archaeologically, we can see that just after 1200, in the area of the coastal plain, we have a new culture which appears with very different material finds than in the previous period. And they settle along the coast in this area marked off in red, in what we call the southern coastal plain in Philistia. And they settle just opposite the green area, which I'm marking off here, the Central Hills. And this is the area where more or less at the same time the Israelites are settling down. Now, this is very interesting because the biblical text, which describes the interaction between the Israelites and the Philistines, was of course written by the Israelites. So we get a view in the biblical text of the Philistines through the Israelite lens. We don't have the opposite view of how the Philistines thought about the Israelites, because we don't have a Philistine Bible. But what we can do is we can start saying, okay, so now we don't have a Philistine Bible, but what does the archaeological remains tell us? And when we start looking at the archaeological remains, we see something very interesting, is that there's a very distinct difference between the Philistine culture, the Israelite culture, and the other groups that we have. And when I was in university a long time ago, the explanation was very simple. The Philistines are a group of people who came from Mycenaean Greece on ships, landed in the coast, sort of like in a D-Day-like operation, captured the Canaanite cities in the coastal plain, took them over, and slowly transformed this. And they lived there. They brought their Mycenaean culture and slowly transformed over the ages. Nowadays, based on our excavations, we can see that the situation is a little more complex, and that it's not people who came from one area, but from several areas, and it was a complex and lengthy process, but nevertheless, most of the Philistines came from outside of the country. And this can be seen, for example, in the pottery. When we look at Philistine pottery, it's unique, it's different, it's very, very easy to identify, and it's very different from the pottery of the other cultures in the region. Completely different from the Israelite pottery, completely different from the Canaanite pottery, and it reflects different traditions of not only the decoration, but what you do with the pottery, because pottery is vessels that you drink from, you eat from, you cook with, and it tells us a different story. And another aspect which we can see quite clearly is when we look at the Philistine diet. And we can see diet based on the animal bones. And when we look at Philistine sites, we see that the Philistines ate pig meat and dog meat. And when we look at Israelite sites or Canaanite sites, we see that their diet was there was much less pig and dog than at the Philistine sites. So on the one hand, people said, okay, this means if you find a site that has pig bones, then it's Philistine, and if it doesn't, it's Judite, and that makes it very simple. And they said that's the beginning of the so-called Jewish traditions of kashrut, of keeping of the dietary laws of the Jews, and it might be. But on the other hand, it's not as simple as that. And it turns out that even in some Israelite and Judite sites, there were people who ate pig. That means that, first of all, not even if there was a tradition of not eating pig, not everybody kept it and did it what was supposed to do. And it could also be that the traditions of not eating pig were something that took a while to develop. And for example, just recently in Jerusalem, in a house dated to the very end of the First Temple period, right before the Babylonian destruction, a little piglet was found. So it means that not everybody in Jerusalem necessarily kept the dietary laws as we understand them nowadays from a later Jewish perspective. And one of the very interesting things that we did with the pig bones, and this is something that's become very dominant in archaeology, and I'm sure if you've heard any other lectures on archaeology, one of the things that we deal with a lot is the integration of archaeological science in archaeology. So one of the things that we did is we analyzed pig bones over various periods, and it turned out that we could see that there's a clear indication in the DNA of the pigs that they were actually brought from Europe, from Greece, to the Levant, to Philistia, during the beginning of the Iron Age. And this is a very interesting point. That means that it's not that the Philistines came here and then caught wild pigs from the Levant, but actually brought squealing pigs with them on the ships from where they came from. And the same thing, by the way, we can see from the plants. And we can identify plants in the archaeological remains based on usually charred, burnt botanical remains. And one of the things that we see is that new types of plants appear when the Philistines' culture appears. And this is, again, a reflection of food habits that are among the Philistines that are different from the food habits of the Israelites and the Canaanites. Now, but big deal food habits, but we all know that food is one of the most important identifiers of who we are, what we are. And we all know if we go and eat food that our grandmother made, it makes us feel good in your belly because it's something very, very basic in your identity. And this is an important aspect in which helps us as archaeologists identify who we're dealing with. Okay, so now let's start moving along the finds from the different periods. In the excavations on the eastern side of the site, in an area where we call Area A, we found remains of of a structure. You can see here marked off in blue. And this structure was comprised of 2 column bases, a rectangular structure, in the middle a plastered platform. And this, based on the finds, it was probably a temple. Now, of course, when we think of a temple with 2 columns in the middle, we think of Samson and knocking down the temple in Gaza, not in Gath, in the biblical text. Needless to say, this doesn't necessarily prove that the Samson story actually occurred, but perhaps it hints to us that the person or people who wrote down the Samson story might have known what a Philistine temple looked like. And this is something which is we return to very often in archaeology of the biblical periods. Biblical archaeology, what we call the archaeology of these periods, is not meant to prove or disprove the Bible. We don't do that, or we shouldn't do that. Rather, biblical archaeology is meant, among other things, to give us the understanding on the cultural background of the groups of people, cultures, societies in which the biblical text formed. And this is a very nice example, is that this doesn't say that we can have proven that the Samson story actually occurred or did occur. Rather, it tells us that perhaps the people writing the Samson story knew what a Philistine temple looked like. And by the way, right next to the temple, and here you can see the temple, we found an area where there was evidence of metallurgy. That means metal production. And those of you who are familiar with the biblical text, in the book of Samuel, it talks about how the Israelites didn't have metal weapons and metal tools, and if they wanted metal tools, they had to go down to the Philistines. And up until recently, we had the opposite evidence. In fact, up until recently, the evidence for metal production was from the Israelite areas and not from the Philistine areas. And here we found a metal production area right next to the temple that I mentioned before. Now, another very interesting topic is the Philistine Barrier. And very, very interestingly, for over 100 years of intense excavation in Philistia, almost no Philistine cemeteries have been found. And I always used to joke with my students is that we know one thing for sure about the Philistines is that they died. There's no question about that. What we didn't know is how they bury themselves. And this was a very big question up until really recent years. And in recent years at es-Safi, we found a cemetery, a Philistine cemetery, and I'll show you in a moment. We excavated one of these tombs. And another Philistine cemetery was found at Ashkelon on the coast. And another one was recently found at the site of Aren Maeir, about 10 kilometers to the south of Gath. So we're starting to get an idea of how the Philistine buried themselves. And here, this is a cave that we found. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of other caves, which hopefully sometime in the future we'll excavate them. And we started excavating the cave, and unfortunately, it was partially robbed. And it had been robbed by a Bedouin who lives right next to this the cemetery about 10 years before our excavation. And as we were excavating, the Bedouin came and told me how he had excavated here, unofficially, and at some point the cave collapsed, so he had to escape. So thank God to the cave which collapsed. He didn't steal all the objects from the tomb, but nevertheless, we got a very nice selection of finds from the tomb, which included pottery and amulets and scarabs and skeletal material. And nowadays, using skeletal material, we can do some very interesting things. First of all, based on the physical anthropological study of the skeletons, we could see that the people buried in the tomb were relatively died at a young age, had a poor diet, and suffered from all kinds of congenital diseases, things like malaria, and they had bad teeth, they had arthritis, and things of the sort. And this, by the way, is a very important point, because very often nowadays we're pumped in the public media the popular media of this concept that, well, if we all go back and eat the food that we ate back when we were cavemen, everything would be great. And that's not true. Archaeologically, when we look at populations from earlier periods, first of all, most of these people died. The average age was 30 or 40. That means it was a rare thing for you to reach 60, 70 years old. And that's why, by the way, a biblical blessing or an ancient blessing is that you should see your grandchildren. I mean, it's a blessing even today, but many, many people manage to see their grandchildren. In antiquity, it was a rare event. And the second thing is people had a hard life. They lost their teeth. They had arthritis. They all kinds of other diseases. It was not an easy life. And this is something that we can see anthropologically. Now, DNA, we've done some DNA analyses, and they should be published in the near future. And it comes out here that the people in this tomb were a very mixed group. And we also did isotopic studies of the bones. And there we could talk about aspects of where they came from and what type of diet they had. And all these things give us very interesting data. And when we combine this with the data coming from other cemeteries at Ashkelon and Aren Maeir, we start getting an idea of the genetic origins of the Philistines, and it's a very complex picture. Some of you may have noticed just last week there was newspaper articles all over the world press of a very interesting study that was just published, which was studying the dental calculus. That's the crap between your teeth. If you don't brush your teeth well enough, that is left. And based on this dental calculus, among other things, from the tombs at Aren Maeir, just to the Philistine cemetery, just to the south of Tel es-Safi, they found evidence of foods coming from all the way in East Asia. That means there was banana and cinnamon and turmeric and things that nobody had any idea, and soy, that any idea that these things were imported into this region, into the region of Israel, ancient Israel at the time, and these were found based on the remains in the teeth. Now, Goliath, as I said, he's one of the most famous people who lived at the site, and the David and Goliath story is a fascinating story. I recommend everybody going back and reading the story if you don't remember it. Now, first of all, it's a complex story, and biblical scholars think that it's a multi-layered story, and that perhaps David was added in at some stage, and Goliath was added in at some stage, and there are various versions. And for example, in some of the versions, Goliath is more or less the size of, he's taller than Wilt Chamberlain. In other places, he's less tall. The name Goliath is interesting. It's a non-Semitic name, and when you look at the military equipment that he is carrying in the biblical text, it's a very interesting melange of various equipment. All kinds of things are very interesting about the story. And of course, he comes from God. And when we excavated this site, of course, people immediately say, well, if you're excavating the site of God, you're going to find skeletons that are enormous, right? And because Goliath was more than something like 8 feet tall, so we're going to find his brothers or him himself, and we're going to find enormous bones. So first of all, we haven't found enormous bones, and in fact, all the bones of people from God, Philistines from God, are completely normal size for this period. And in fact, I would guess that the reason why Goliath and other people from God and other Philistines are described as giants, it's because the biblical text wants to exaggerate the size of the enemies of Israel. Just like, when you go fishing and you catch a fish this size, you tell your friends that you catch a fish this size. So I think that's something in this aspect. And another very interesting, fascinating find is that we found a small inscription at the site, which on it has apparently 2 names written in a very archaic alphabetic text. And these names, they're not Goliath, but they're 2 names that are very similar to the name Goliath. They come from the same family of names as the name Goliath. So what this means is that while we haven't found evidence of Goliath, either in his bones or an inscription of Goliath, we do have evidence that at Gath, at Philistine Gath, more or less at the time of David and Goliath, that means the 10th century, there were people with similar names. And we haven't found Goliath's cereal bowl, but not far from it. Next. Now, perhaps the most dramatic archaeological evidence that we have at the site is the site's complete destruction around 830 BCE at the hands of Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus. And this is an event which is described very briefly in 2 Kings 12:18 in the Hebrew version, or 17 in some of the other versions. And what we find is that wherever we excavate on the site, we find the remains of an enormous destruction. All the houses burnt down, things collapsed, objects where they were found, sometimes the skeletons of people found in the destruction. And this is on the upper city and the lower city, wherever we go. And here, and this is what we call Stratum A3, and we can find complete assemblages of hundreds upon hundreds of vessels. It's almost like a Pompeian moment, something that, this astounding destruction, which gives us this window into exactly what was happening at the site at the time, where people stored their food, where they ate, where they did everything. And some of the vessels that we find are so well preserved that they look as if they came out of the potter's workshop the day before the destruction. And they look as if they're ready to go straight into the museum. And this is an astounding opportunity. And every year we excavate in this destruction level. And I must say, there is nothing more fun than pulling out a complete vessel from 3,000 years ago. People remember this, and it's really quite an experience. Some of the finds are very interesting. For example, here we have cooking vessels and cultic vessels. And this is a vessel which we call a beer jug. And from this vessel and another similar one, we managed to isolate the ancient yeast here, this vessel and this vessel, the ancient yeast cells that were originally in this vessel. It's not the same yeast cells, but it's their great, 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 great grandchildren who continue to exist throughout the ages. And we were able to identify these yeast cells, to grow them, to make to check what their species was. And it turned out these were the species that you make beer with. And subsequently, we actually made beer. And the beer was very, very tasty. And here you can see, this is the team, a bunch of archaeologists and a bunch of microbiologists who we teamed together to make this. And here we're tasting the first sample of the beer as it was taken out from the bottles that we made. And just before we tasted it, I told everybody is that either it's going to be tasty or in 5 minutes we're all going to be dead. And we lived to tell the story. And it was so good that we're even thinking of making this into selling it to a beer company and making a special beer. And the suggestion is to call it Goliath beer. Now, just like we had remains of the destruction in the upper city, the same thing goes for the lower city. And the lower city is even more unique because the upper city, after the destruction by Hazael, in most of the areas, after a century, after 2 centuries, after 1,000 years, people came back and built up. So when we excavate in the upper city, we very often have to go through many, many layers of later finds until we get to the Hazael destruction. On the other hand, in the lower city, the situation is different. There, the Philistine city existed, but after the Hazael destruction, nobody ever came and settled there. So that means that when I come to the lower city nowadays, I can sometimes see on surface, before excavation, the architecture, the remains of the architecture of the Iron Age city. And if I start excavating, right below surface, I start finding those enormously rich finds from the destruction. And we started excavating in various areas. And I'll talk about first in this area, and then afterwards we'll go to the eastern area. And in the western area, we found a temple, again, with the fascinating finds of the destruction of Hazael with the complete vessels. You can see oodles and oodles. And very, very importantly, in the center of this temple, a unique stone altar. And this stone altar is very special because on the one hand, it's similar to the altars that we know from the biblical text with the four four horns. And similar altars have been found in other Israelite sites and sites in the Iron Age. But on the other hand, it's different. So it's on the one hand, it's there are some connections with Israelite cultic traditions. On the other hand, it's different. And this is a very nice example of how the Philistine cultures, on the one hand, it combines foreign elements and local elements together, even in the same object. Now, when we start here, we had Area D, and right next to the temple, which is located over here, we found. Before I get to that, again, we'll stop for a second. As I explained, the lower city is an area where right below surface we have the ancient remains. Now, we excavate what we can, but you can't excavate everything. Modern archaeology demands careful, slow excavation. And even if I worked for 100 years at this site, I wouldn't be able to excavate the entire thing. So what we do is we use methods called remote sensing, which basically help us see below the surface and give us an idea of what the finds are below the surface. And based on the remote sensing, and this is type of remote sensing called magnetometry, that basically is we shoot out electromagnetic waves, and the way they bounce back, we can tell what's going to be under the surface. And based on this, we can find areas where to excavate, and you'll see some areas in a moment where we excavated based on the remote sensing. And where we don't excavate, we can connect the dots between the excavated areas based on the remote sensing. So it's sort of like a way of adding additional information, even though we haven't excavated. And next to the temple, we found this big gate of the city. And this is one of the gates of Gath. And the gates of Gath are important because we have a great story in the biblical text in which David, when running away from King Saul didn't like him, he was chasing him. He runs away to the city of Gath, to the king of Gath, Achish, and Achish and his servants meet David at the gate, and David wants to come in, and Achish's servants say, "What are you letting this guy in? This is the guy who killed our friend Goliath." And David realizes he's in danger. He fakes that he's mad, and this occurred at the gate of Gath. So, of course, finding a gate of Gath is very, very interesting. It's not necessarily this gate, but it's one of the gates of Gath. And here you can see the various plans. But when we took the remote sensing of the entire lower area, this is remote sensing, and you can see from the remote sensing all kinds of features that appear all over. And for example, look over here, there's these straight lines and what seem to be rooms, and there's a building here situated over here. And based on these remains, we decided, let's excavate here and let's excavate here. And we opened up an area here and an area here, and we found astounding remains. Here we found remains from the destruction of the Hazael, the destruction of the city, and below it early remains. Here we found a very large building from the time of the Iron Age. You can see another view of it. And slightly to the south, exactly based on the remains that we saw in the remote sensing, we opened up an excavation area. We found several houses and an alleyway and the plan, and these fit in exactly as it was marked off here. Here you can see the alleyway, here you can see the houses. So it gave us a very clear indication of what we were going to find. And in fact, it turned out that in each house, there was an olive press. And this olive press was for producing olive oil, which was one of the most important staples of the agricultural economy in the ancient Near East. And here you can see some of the fantastic finds coming out on surface. You can see this is the surface, and right below surface, this is what you're finding: complete vessels, loom weights, and all kinds of different complete vessels as they're coming out. And if you look at the smiles that these people have as they pull out a complete vessel, it really is an experience. And over the 25 years of excavation, hundreds, if not several thousands of people have come to Excavating Tell, es-Safi. And I must say that every time a volunteer team member pulls out a complete vessel, it's something that he or she have a smile that they'll never forget, and it's something that they will tell about to their friends, children, grandchildren for as long as they live. And here you can see these are finds that are 3,000 years old, and you're finding them as if they came out of the potter's workshop the day before yesterday. And this is the dramatic remains of the Hazael destruction, and this is in fact the end of the Philistine city. And when the Hazael destruction is over, we basically say goodbye to the Philistines at Tell es-Safi. Now, before we end the story of the Philistines at Tell es-Safi, we have to deal with a very interesting thing. When I started the project in 1996, one of the first things I do is I looked for early aerial photographs, and I found aerial photographs taken in the 1970s, and I found an aerial photograph taken in the 1945, just at the end of World War II, by the British Air Force. And here you can see an aerial photograph of the tell. Here, the upper tell with the village of Tell es-Safi on it. This is the lower tell, and you can see there's no construction here. But the most interesting thing I saw was this feature surrounding the site from the eastern, southern, and western side. And here, marked off on the plan, you can see this feature here. And what this turns out to be is an enormous siege system that surrounds the site, which was built by Hazael. And this siege system comprised of a deep trench, about 2 kilometers long, dug down into the bedrock. And along the trench, there was probably a wall and several towers. We found 2 of them. There's probably more. And this was built to enclose the city. And we mentioned before that in one of the future lectures you're going to get a tour of Masada. Masada is, of course, famous for the last stand of the Zealots in the end of the Second Temple period. But of course, there's the Roman siege around it. And this siege is 900 years earlier, an Aramean siege, and in fact, it's probably the earliest known siege that we have in the world from an archaeological perspective. And the Arameans built this siege system around the site to prevent the besieged people of Gath from escaping, to prevent them from attacking the besiegers, and to prevent them from receiving supplies and reinforcements. And we don't know how long this siege took, but it probably took several months. But in the end, it was effective, because when we go on site, we find the entire site was destroyed. And so the destruction of Gath, as we see in the areas from the destroyed houses and all the remains, are reinforced by the remains of this astounding siege system that we find afterwards. Now, Philistine Gath is over. And in fact, in 830, that's the end of the Philistine city of Gath. And for example, in later biblical and Assyrian sources, when they mention Philistine cities, there's no mention of Gath, because Gath doesn't exist anymore. But we did find some interesting remains from the end of the Iron Age on the site. And one of them is a very interesting story. And if you open the book of Amos, chapter 1, verse 1, when Amos tells us when he prophesied, he tells us that he started prophesying 2 years after the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. the king of Judah. And here at Gath and at a few other sites, they have found evidence of a mid-8th century earthquake. And you can see it very nicely here. Here you have the 9th century destruction level. That's the Hazael destruction level. Right above it, we find a big pile of fallen mud bricks. And between the destruction level and the mud bricks, we have what we call aeolian sediment, which is a fancy way of saying wind-blown dust, which accumulated over years. So that means that before the bricks fell, there were quite a few years of dust being collected on top of the 9th century destruction level, and then it fell. And then on top of the bricks, we have 2 late 8th century levels. So that means somewhere between 830 and sometime in the late 8th century, let's say 701, 712, something like that, these bricks fell. Now, if we try to figure historically when the earthquake of Uzziah was, most scholars would place it around 760. This fits in perfectly. And so what we apparently have here is evidence of the earthquake. And how did the earthquake work? Earthquakes have 2 waves of energy. Usually you first have the first wave is a horizontal wave, which pushes walls off their foundation. And then a few seconds later, the second wave, which is called the S wave, and it has a wavy shape, hits the walls, and that usually causes the bricks, a wall to collapse over. And so we have here very nicely, the wall was pushed and then collapsed. And here we have excellent evidence of this mid-8th century destruction. And this fits in beautifully with the evidence from the book of Amos, 2 years before the earthquake. And several centuries later, in the book of Zechariah, they still remember the mid-8th century earthquake, which hit Jerusalem in the time of Uzziah, the king of Judah. And the same thing, there are hints in the book of Isaiah. So we have here a very nice interface between the biblical texts and various memories of a mid-8th century earthquake. And nowadays, the geologists say that there may have been more than one earthquake in the 8th century. And on the other hand, the archaeological remains from Gath and from other sites which tell us this story. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to say thank you. And here you can see us excavations. And if all goes well, as opposed to the summer of 2020, in the summer of 2021, we plan to be in the field. And from the 4th of July to the 30th of July, we'll be excavating. And I invite you all to join us. And one of the members of the crowd, Jim, has already expressed interest in joining. I hope others will. And if you want to, go to our website, gath.wordpress.com. And there you can find information about the project, information about volunteering, online registration, and hopefully, with the vaccinations in Israel and the vaccinations throughout the world, sometime in the late spring, maybe early summer, things will go back to normal, and you can join us. And in the meantime, if you want to read a little more about the project, you can go to the website, or those of you who have access online, go to the Near Eastern archaeology issues. There are 2 issues that are completely devoted to the excavations at the site, and you can read all kinds of interesting things there. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope I'll see you in the summer. Okay, so I'm going to stop the sharing. And if there are any questions, I'm open to answering.
So first of all, Professor Maeir, thank you so much. It was amazing to listen to you. I've been to Tel es-Safi quite a few times before, but This was the best presentation ever, and actually quite a few great news. I've heard about the beer. I never tasted it, but yeah, all I tried is the Carlsberg beer in Ashkelon, which is not far away. So thank you very much. Before we turn to questions, I would like to join your invitation to excavate Tell es-Safi. Part of the VFI project is archaeology, so I really hope that whenever possible, and hopefully this coming summer, you will have quite a few volunteers which are already knowledgeable. And ladies and gentlemen, you are so much welcome to Excavate Tell es-Safi. And finding whole vessels which are almost 3,000 years old is an amazing experience, which I can only imagine. I never had more than, pieces. So I'm looking forward to it for myself. And I would also like to thank very much Pastor Jim Allen, who made the match. He was the one who offered me to address Professor Maeir and invite him to give
Thanks,
a
Jim.
presentation. And I enjoyed it.
Well, Aren is the very best. Yeah. I just want to mention that I took Aren has an online course in biblical archaeology. And Aren, you can probably tell them about that, but I took Aren's online course in biblical archaeology, and I recommend it to everybody if you have a chance to take it.
Okay, Jim is talking about, I have a MOOC, a massive open online course. It's called Biblical Archaeology. It's on the edX platform, and I enjoyed making it. People like Jim tell me they enjoyed taking it, and in fact, it will be running again in the second semester, which starts in this March. So any of you want to take it, you can take it for free, or you can also take it for credit, and it's a lot of fun. And of course, you'll learn about archaeology in general, but also about the excavations at Tell es-Safi. So if any of you are thinking of coming, it's a great way to get an introduction to the site and what we do and what archaeology is in general. And just one more point, if we do excavate, most probably, I haven't finalized this, but I'm going to request that anybody who comes has to show that they got vaccinated or have or we're sick already or something like that, and they because I think there's going to be a lot of medical requirements to enable to open up for public activities such as this. If you go to edx.org, I'll write it over here. I'll write it up to everybody. It's on the edx.org, and it's called Biblical Archaeology, and of course Aren Maeir. And if you go there, you can find it. No, if any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Okay, so Professor Maeir, we actually have a few questions now on chat, so if you'd like to read it, or otherwise I can read it for you.
Okay, let me go up. I'll look at them. Okay, let's see. How many strata? Okay, that's a good question. How many levels that we have? We have levels that the earliest levels of the site are from what we call the early Bronze Age, which is about 3000 BCE. And then we have more or less continuous occupation of the site until the modern time, until the Arab village that was abandoned in 1948. So it's hard to count the strata because not in every place you have the same thing, but we have 15, 20 various periods and levels throughout the site. The beer story, yes, I enjoy telling the beer story. We won't be excavating in the autumn, we'll be in the summer, but because that's when we excavate, because that's when I have off from teaching, my students have off from studying, and volunteers usually don't have are off on their vacation. Clearly, the world is crazy now, so things have changed. But if we do excavate, we'll be excavating in the summer. Okay. When can we get that beer? Well, that depends on if we manage to sell the recipe to a company and they make it. So this is being discussed right now. Let me see, anything else? I put the online information on the course. Oh, where do you house the volunteers? Okay, good question. We stay at a kibbutz nearby, which is called Kibbutz Kfar Menachem, and we live in the regional school, which is in the kibbutz there, which is empty at that time of the year. So there are dormitory-like facilities, and you can have a room. You have a room with air conditioning, and you can, depending on what you pay, you either get the room for yourself or with 2 people, with 4 people. And I wouldn't say it's a 5-star hotel, but it's sort of like hostel-like accommodations with air conditioning, very important in the summer in Israel. And of course, a shower and a bathroom on the room. And the food we try to give plentiful, nourishing food because people work hard. And I relate to the type of food that the volunteers should get is sort of equivalent to what soldiers going through basic training get. It has to be high caloric content, a lot of it, because throughout the day you're doing a lot of hard physical work. Do you find forms? How far is? One second, hold on. There's a couple of questions I missed. Okay, what is the motivation to completely destroy a city rather than occupy it? Well, we don't always know, but we do know something that happens very often is that when a besieging army has to besiege a town for a long time, very often when they finally do break into the city, they are very frustrated and angry and mad and take out all their frustrations on the city, and very often will completely destroy the city. And it could very well be that one of the reasons why Hazael besieged Gath is because he wanted to overpower Gath. They refused to accept his conditions, and when they didn't, and especially after probably holding out in a siege for several months, the site was completely destroyed. Now, another question is, how far is Gath from Khirbet Kayafa? Khirbet Kayafa is an important excavation, which the excavator thinks it's a Judite site from the time of King David. My inclination is to agree with him on that. I don't agree on all his interpretation, but I think the site was destroyed by the city of Gath. And it's about 10 kilometers to the east. Do you find any forms of weapons and jewelry? Yes, we do. We've found various types of arrows and arrowheads. We actually found a very interesting bone arrowhead, which we're about to publish an article on, and jewelry. We found both on the site and in the tomb that I showed you before. What are the volunteer daily work schedule? Well, we start excavating at 5:45 in the morning till 1. Then we go back to the kibbutz, we eat lunch, and then we have afternoon activities, which include pottery washing, occasional lecture, field trips, and other things related to the project. And then usually after supper, everybody's so tired they just go to sleep. And you wake up the next morning around 5, so it's you need your sleep. How do you determine the age of the dead? This is something that you can do based on physical anthropology. That means study of the bones and the teeth, because humans, their teeth and their bones change according to the various ages that they're at. And so you can give an assessment of age, an assessment of health, an assessment of sex based on the study of the bones and the teeth. You said you just searched for EDX.org. You know what? Hold on. I'm just going to go out here. I'll go to it in a second. Hold on. Let me go go here. Here, I'm with you. I'm just looking for. Hold on. Here it is. I'll put this on the chat now. Okay, now I'm going to go up here, open it up, chat to everyone. There it is. Okay? Okay. Next. Hold on. Okay. Were the Philistines around the time of Abraham? That's a very interesting question, because in the biblical text you have it talks about Abraham, the patriarch, going to meet Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, in the area in the northwestern Negev. Now, if Abraham lived before the Iron Age, there were no Philistines. There simply were not. Some scholars suggest that perhaps the stories of Abraham, reflect traditions from the Iron Age. And if that's the case, the area of the northwestern Negev, there were Philistines there during the Iron Age. So it could very well be that the biblical tradition about Abraham meeting the Philistines in the northwestern Negev at the site of Gerar reflects something from the Iron Age. Okay, yes. edX also has a course on archaeology. Is there a minimal limit to the amount of time you can spend on the site? Yes. We require that volunteer team members who are coming to join the excavation come for a minimal time of 2 weeks. The project goes on for 4 weeks, and we want you to come for 2 weeks for the simple reason is that it takes a few days to understand what you have to do. And then once you get into it, it's not rocket science, but nevertheless, you do have to understand what you have to do. And then you have a period of a week and a half or so in which you're working full blown. And that's why we prefer that people come. And it also, the experience is much more vivid. Go on. Okay, I think that's it.
Well, it seems to be, that's it. Everything was clear, you know. That's what happens when you have such a great presentation. You actually answer the questions before people ask them. So,
okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we hope to meet you again. We hope to come and dig Gath and finally find Goliath.
Even if you can't come for 2 weeks to volunteer for the excavation and you are in Israel in the summer, you're invited to come visit the excavation while it's going on. You can come and just see what's going on. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Okay.
Professor, thank you so much.
Professor,
one
last question. Is there an age limit?
Is there an age limit? We accept people from 16 and up. From 16 to 95.
Okay. And then, well, that covers everybody here. Great. Okay, thank you very much and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you all. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Great.
Okay, great. That was an amazing presentation.
Yes.
Team, thank you again. It was really awesome.
Very good.
Terrific, great presentation. Loved it.
Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any other questions, VFI related or digging related or VFI plus archaeology related.
Does this archaeology dig compare to the other ones that you have as part of VFI Israel?
So the VFI plus archaeology that we offer, the dig is at the city of David. So it's a different location, and you're working with Tel Aviv University, the head of archaeology there, and archaeologists under that, and Israel Antiquities Authority, which I'm sure is also related and working with this professor. But it's just a different area, and they're both well-known digs. Oh, and also for ours, you can work until you reach whatever age. You could be 150 as long as your doctor signs off on it. So we do need a doctor to sign off. And it's not a minimum of 2 weeks. You can do it for 1 week. So with BFI Plus Archaeology, it's 1 week at City of David, 1 week volunteering on the base, and the rest of your time is traveling around with this woman, Julia, who we have grown to know and love.
Could you keep the artifact that you find?
What was particularly unique in this site is the fact of finding something intact. Carol and I have been on many, many digs, and it's exceptional. You find a complete jug, a complete oil lamp. It's very exciting.
I think it was a setup.
Carol, I thought your specialty was finding bananas.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Well, I just have a comment that every time I'm on one of these Zooms, I get more and more impressed with the quality of the people that Julia brings to us. This was just breathtaking today, just amazing.
Yes, and thanks to Pastor Jim for hooking us up as well.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. It's a team operation.
Yeah.
This is a fabulous way to wrap up 2020, otherwise a miserable year. And I'm delighted we're entering 2021 as quickly as we can.